All right. I learned a few things about how to make sure that my streams don't get cut off at the end. Important stuff. Um, and also, it should run a little bit smoother. So today I'm going to reread part of chapter 23 and then head into chapter 24. So I hope you're all comfortable. Hope you've got something tasty to drink. Nice and relaxed. I'm getting a haircut tomorrow. I don't know why you would care, but you can look forward to that. I've got that going for me. Okay, so where we left off was that Poirot got all the players in the room and he was trying to paint a picture of the fact that everybody thought Mr. Ackroyd was talking to someone. But what it actually turned out to be, after Poirot did some research, was that Ackroyd had purchased a dictaphone, which in 1920 something was like a cutting edge voice recorder. So he wasn't talking to anyone, he was talking to the machine. So that's what kind of where they're at with that. And so we'll pick up there because that got cut off in the stream yesterday. And then we'll go from there. Let's see here. So I may not see comments because I'm reading, but I will check them in between chapters. Let's see here. Yep. Okay, let's go for it. Got a new setup here as far as like camera goes. My buddy Randy at work gave me some good pointers. I think I found a way I can get the fireplace involved, so we'll get a little crackling log going. So you can look forward to that. Also, I wanted to say thanks again to those that have donated to Everyday Action. That's really cool. And that particular charity gets food from film sets, you know, TV commercials, movies, and gets it into the hands of the needy, you know, so that nothing goes to waste. And that food is amazing. I mean, you've not eaten better than when you've eaten on set. It's just that good. So I'm glad to hear that wonderful food doesn't go to waste, and I'm happy to be trying to help make that happen. So thanks again. And so I think what I'll do, for now at least, is every time we start a new book, we'll start a new campaign for that charity maybe. Unless I get too broke, and then the charity will be me. I'm kidding. No, am I? I don't know. I don't know. I haven't quite got the courage to ask people to donate to a stream, so not yet. It has to be, you know, a little farther along. But for now, we're going to donate to charity. So let's do that. Okay. I'm going to start here towards the end of chapter 23. Oh, actually, I wanted to read it a bit more to camera. So let me do that. Yeah, there we go. Feels a little more personable. Okay. All right, here we go. Oh, give me just a second. The monitor is having a problem. My monitors are going in and out today. That's not fun. It looks like we're still streaming. If it happens again, we'll just have to take a few seconds of a break, and then I'll work on that another time. Looks like our video's still going, though. Hey, Randy. Hey, ThunderDan88. I'm having some issues with my monitors, but we're going to try to plod on. All right, here we go. Not sure why my monitors keep wanting to reset, but you know what? I think I'll just turn this one off for now. How about that? Okay. Maybe that'll help. Okay. Surely a man wouldn't read letters of that type aloud to himself, not unless he was, well, going balmy. You have all forgotten one thing, said Poirot softly. The stranger who called at the house the preceding Wednesday. They all stared at him. But yes, said Poirot, nodding encouragingly. On Wednesday, the young man was not of himself important, but the firm he represented interested me very much. The dictaphone company, gasped Raymond. I see it now, a dictaphone. That's what you think? Poirot nodded. Mr. Ackroyd had promised to invest in a dictaphone, you remember? I had the curiosity to inquire of the company in question. Their reply is that Mr. Ackroyd did purchase a dictaphone from their representative. Why he concealed the matter from you, I do those words in casual. I do not know. We'll get there. He must have meant to surprise me with it, murmured Raymond. He had quite a childish love of surprising people, meant to keep it up his sleeve for a day or so. Probably was playing with it like a new toy. Yes, it fits in. You're quite right. No one would use those words in casual conversation. It explains, too, said Poirot, why Major Blunt thought it was you who were in the study. Such scraps as came to him were fragments of dictation, and so his subconscious mind deduced that you were with him since you are his secretary. His conscious mind was occupied with something quite different. The white figure he had caught a glimpse of. He fancied it was Miss Ackroyd. Really, of course, it was Ursula Bourne's white apron he saw as she was stealing down to the summer house. Raymond had recovered from his first surprise. All the same, he remarked, this discovery of yours, brilliant though it is, I'm quite sure I should never have thought of it, leaves the essential position unchanged. Mr. Ackroyd was alive at 9:30. Since he was speaking into the dictaphone, it seems clear that the man Charles Kent was really off the premises by then. As to Ralph Patton, he hesitated, glancing at Ursula. Her color flared up, but she answered steadily enough. Ralph and I parted just before 9:45. He never went near the house, I'm sure of that. He had no intention of doing so. The last thing... Oh, my monitor just went out again. I'm going to have to figure that out. Okay, we're back. Goodness gracious. Ralph and I parted just before 9:45. He never went near the house. I am sure of that. He had no intention of doing so. The last thing on earth he wanted was to face his stepfather. He would have flunked it badly. It isn't that I doubt your story for a moment, explained Raymond. I've always been quite sure Captain Patton was innocent, but one has to think of a court of law and the questions that would be asked. He is in a most unfortunate position. But if he were to come forward... Poirot interrupted. This is your advice, yes? That he should come forward? Certainly, if you know where he is. I perceive that you do not believe that I know, and yet I have told you just now that I know everything. The truth of the phone call, of the footprints on the windowsill, of the hiding place of Ralph Patton. Where is he? Said Blunt sharply. Not very far away, said Poirot, smiling. In Cranchester? I asked. Poirot turned towards me. You always ask me that. The idea of Cranchester, it is with you like an idea fixe. No, he is not in Cranchester. He is there. He pointed a dramatic finger. Everyone's head turned. Ralph Patton was standing in the doorway. Chapter 24. It was a very uncomfortable Oh, there goes my monitor again. Ooh. Come back. The power is resetting on my monitor. Okay. Not sure what that's about. It was a very uncomfortable minute for me. I hardly took in what happened next, but there were exclamations of cries and surprise. When I was sufficiently master of myself to be able to realize what was going on, Ralph Patton was standing by his wife, her hand in his, and he was smiling across the room at me. Poirot, too, was smiling, and at the same time shaking an eloquent finger at me. Have I not told you at least 36 times that it is useless to conceal things from Hercule Poirot, he demanded. That in such a case he finds out. He turned to the others. One day, you remember, we held a little seance about the table, just the 6 of us. I accused the other 5 persons present of concealing something from me. 4 of them gave up their secret. Dr. Shepherd did not give up his, but all along I had my suspicions. Dr. Shepherd went to the 3 Boars that night hoping to find Ralph. He did not find him there, but supposing, I said to myself, that he met him in the street on his way home. Dr. Shepherd was a friend of Captain Patton's, and he had come straight from the scene of the crime. He must know that things looked very black against him. Perhaps he knew more than the general public did. I did, I said ruefully. I suppose I might as well make a clean breast of things. I went to see Ralph that afternoon. After he refused to take me into his confidence, but later he told me about his marriage and the hole he was in. As soon as the murder was discovered, I realized that once the facts were known, suspicion could not fail to attach to Ralph, or if not to him, to the girl he loved. That night I put the facts plainly before him. The thought of having possibly to give evidence which might incriminate his wife made his resolve at all costs to I hesitated, and Ralph filled up the gap. To do a bunk, he said graphically. You see, Ursula left me to go back to the house. I thought it possible that she might have attempted to have another interview with my stepfather. He had already been very rude to her that afternoon. It occurred to me that he might have insulted her in such an unforgivable manner that without knowing what she was doing, he stopped. Ursula raised her hand from his and stepped back. You thought that, Ralph? You actually thought that I might have done it? Let us get back to the culpable conduct of Dr. Shepherd, said Poirot dryly. Dr. Shepherd consented to do what he could to help him. He was successful in hiding Captain Patton from the police. Where? Asked Raymond. In his own house? Ah, no, indeed, said Poirot. You should ask yourselves the question that I did. If the good doctor is concealing the young man, what place would he choose? It must necessarily be somewhere near at hand. I think of Cranchester. A hotel? No. Lodgings? Even more empathetically, no. Where then? Ah, I have it. A nursing home. A home for the mentally unfit. I test my theory. I invent a nephew with mental trouble. I consult Mademoiselle Shepherd as to suitable homes. She gives me the names of 2 near Cranchester to which her brother has sent patients. I make inquiries. Yes, at one of them a patient was brought there by the doctor himself early on Saturday morning. That patient, though known by another name, I had no difficulty in identifying as Captain Patton. After certain formalities, I was allowed to bring him away. He arrived at my house in the early hours of yesterday morning. I looked at him ruefully. Caroline's home office expert, I murmured, and to think I never guessed. You see now why I drew attention to the reticence of your manuscript, murmured Poirot. It was strictly truthful as far as it went, but it did not go very far, my friend? I was too abashed to argue. Dr. Shepherd has been very loyal, said Ralph. He has stood by me through thick and thin. He did what he thought was best. I see now, from what Monsieur Poirot has told me, that it was not really the best. I should have come forward and faced the music. You see, in the home, we never saw a newspaper. I knew nothing of what was going on. Dr. Shepherd has been a model of discretion, said Poirot dryly. But to me, I discover all the little secrets. It's my business. Now, can we have your story of what happened that night? Said Raymond impatiently. You know it already, said Ralph. There's very little for me to add. I left the summer house about 9:45 and tramped about the lanes. Oh, there goes my monitor again. That's a bummer. There we go. And we're back. I left the summer house about 9:45 and tramped about the lanes, trying to make up my mind as to what to do next, what line to take. I'm bound to admit that I have not the shadow of an alibi. Oh, this is not Poirot. But I gave you my solemn word that I never went to the study and I never saw my stepfather alive or dead. Whatever the world thinks, I'd like all of you to believe me. No alibi, murmured Raymond. That's bad. I believe you, of course, but it's a bad business. It makes things very simple, though, said Poirot in a cheerful voice. Very simple indeed. We all stared at him. You see what I mean, no? Just this. To save Captain Patton, the real criminal must confess. He beamed round at all of us. But yes, I mean what I say. See now, I did not invite Inspector Raglan to be present. That was for a reason. I did not want to tell him all that I knew. At least I did not want to tell him tonight. He leaned forward and suddenly his voice and his whole personality changed. He suddenly became dangerous. I who speak to you, I know the murderer of Mr. Ackroyd is in this room now. It is the murderer to which I speak. Tomorrow the truth goes to Inspector Raglan. You understand? There was a tense silence. Into the midst of it came the old Breton woman with a telegram on a salver. Poirot tore it open. Blunt's voice rose abrupt and resonant. The murderer is among us, you say? You know? Which? Poirot had read the message. He crumpled it up in his hands. I know. Now. He tapped the crumpled ball of paper. What is that? Said Raymond sharply. A wireless message from a steamer now on her way to the United States. There was a dead silence. Poirot rose to his feet, bowing. Messieurs et mesdames, this reunion of mine is at an end. Remember, the truth goes to Inspector Raglan in the morning. Chapter 25, The Whole Truth. A slight gesture from Poirot enjoined me to stay behind the rest. I obeyed, going over to the fire and thoughtfully stirring the big logs on it with the toe of my boot. I was puzzled. For the first time, I was absolutely at sea as to Poirot's meaning. For a moment, I was inclined to think that the scene I had just witnessed was a gigantic piece of bombast, that he had been what he called playing the comedy with a view to making himself interesting and important. But, in spite of myself, I was forced to believe in an underlying reality. There had been real menace in his words, a certain indisputable sincerity, but I still believed him to be on an entirely the wrong tack. When the door shut behind the last of the party, he came over to the fire. Well, my friend, he said quietly, and what do you think of it all? I don't know what to think, I said frankly. What's the point? Why not go straight to Inspector Raglan with the truth instead of giving the guilty person this elaborate warning? Poirot sat down and drew out his case of tiny Russian cigarettes. He smoked for a minute or two in silence. Then, use your little gray cells, he said. There is always a reason behind my actions. I hesitated for a moment, and then I said slowly, the first one that occurs to me is that you yourself do not know who the guilty person is, but that you are sure that he is to be found amongst the people here tonight. Therefore, your words were intended to force a confession from the unknown murderer. Poirot nodded approvingly. A clever idea, but not the truth. I thought perhaps that by making him believe you knew, you might force him out into the open. Not necessarily by confession. He might try to silence you as he formerly silenced Mr. Ackroyd before you could act tomorrow morning. A trap with myself as the bait. Merci, mon ami, but I am not sufficiently heroic for that. Then I fail to understand you. Surely you are running the risk of letting the murderer escape by putting him on guard. Poirot shook his head. He cannot escape, he said gravely. There is only one way out, and that way does not lead to freedom. You really believe me? You really believe that one of those people here tonight committed the murder? I asked incredulously. Yes, my friend. Which one? There was a silence for some minutes. Then Poirot tossed the stump of his cigarette into the grate and began to speak in a quiet, reflective tone. I will take you the way that I have traveled myself. Step by step you shall accompany me and see for yourself that all the facts point indisputably to one person. Now, to begin with, there were two facts and one little discrepancy in time which especially attracted my attention. The first fact was the telephone call. If Ralph Patton were indeed the murderer, the telephone call became meaningless and absurd. Therefore, I said to myself, Ralph Patton is not the murderer. I satisfied myself that the call could not have been sent by anyone in the house, yet I was convinced that it was amongst those present on the fateful evening that I had to look for my criminal. Therefore, I concluded that the telephone call must have been sent by an accomplice. I was not quite pleased with that deduction, but I let it stand for the minute. I next examined the motive for the call. That was difficult. I could only get at it by judging its result, which was that the murder was discovered that night instead of, in all probability, the following morning. You agree with that? Yes, I admitted, yes. As you say, Mr. Ackroyd having given orders that he was not to be disturbed, nobody would have been likely to go to the study that night. Très bien. The affair marches, does it not? But matters were still obscure. What was the advantage of having the crime discovered that night in preference to the following morning? The only idea I could get a hold of was that the murderer, knowing the crime was to be discovered at a certain time, could make sure of being present when the door was broken in, or at any rate immediately afterwards. And now we come to the second fact. The chair pulled out from the wall. Inspector Raglan dismissed that as not important. I, on the contrary, have always regarded it as of supreme importance. In your manuscript, you have drawn a neat little plan of the study. If you had it with you this minute, you would see that the chair being drawn out in the position indicated by Parker, it would stand in a direct line between the door and the window. The window, I said quickly. You, too, have my first idea. I imagined that the chair was drawn out so that something connected with the window should not be seen by anyone entering through the door. But I soon abandoned that supposition, for the chair was a grandfather with a high back. It obscured very little of the window, only the part between the sash and the ground. No, mon ami, but remember that just in front of the window there stood a table with books and magazines upon it. Now the table was completely hidden by the drawn-out chair, and immediately I had my first shadowy suspicion of the truth. Supposing that there had been something on that... Wait a minute, is this him? Supposing that there had been something on that table not intended to be seen, something placed there by the murderer. As yet I had no inkling of what that something might be, but I knew certain, very interesting facts about it. For instance, it was something that the murderer had not been able to take away with him at the time that he committed the crime. At the same time, it was vital that it should be removed as soon as possible after the crime had been discovered. And so, the telephone message, the opportunity for the murderer to be on the spot when the body was discovered. Now 4 people were on the scene when the police arrived. Yourself, Parker, Major Blunt, and Mr. Raymond. Parker I eliminated at once, since at whatever time the crime was discovered, he was the one person certain to be on the spot. And it was he who told me of the pulled-out chair. Parker, then, was cleared of the murder, that is. I still thought it possible that he had been blackmailing Mrs. Ferrars. Raymond and Blunt, however, remained under suspicion. If the crime had been discovered in the early hours of the morning, it was quite possible that they might... Oop, give me just a moment. What is going on with my monitor? Sorry, folks. Well, they can't all go as smooth as the rest. All right. Let's see. Okay, we're back. All right, let's hope it stays with me. I've only got the rest of this chapter in me. Little intermission if you need a stretch. We're getting to the good part. Okay. Now, what was that object? You heard my arguments tonight in reference to the scrap of conversation overheard. As soon as I learned that a representative of a dictaphone company had called, the idea of a dictaphone took root in my mind. You heard what I said in this room not half an hour ago, yeah? They all agreed with my theory, but one vital fact seems to have escaped them. Granted that a dictaphone was being used by Mr. Ackroyd that night, why was no dictaphone found? I never thought of that, I said. We know that a dictaphone was supplied to Mr. Ackroyd, but no dictaphone has been found amongst his effects. So, if something was taken from the table, why should not that something be the dictaphone? But there were certain difficulties in the way. The attention of everyone was, of course, focused on the murdered man. I think anyone could have gone to the table unnoticed by the other people in the room, but a dictaphone has a certain bulk. It cannot be slipped casually into a pocket. There must have been a receptacle of some kind capable of holding it. You see where I am arriving. The figure of the murderer is taking shape. A person who was on the scene straight away, but who might not have been if the crime had been discovered the following morning. A person carrying a receptacle into which the dictaphone might be fitted. I interrupted. But why remove the dictaphone? What was the point? You are like Mr. Raymond. You take it for granted that what was heard at 9:30 was Mr. Ackroyd's voice speaking into a dictaphone. But consider this useful invention for a little minute. You dictate into it, do you not? And at some time later, a secretary or a typist turns it on, and the voice speaks again. You mean... Poirot nodded. Yes, I meant that. At 9:30, Mr. Ackroyd was already dead. It was the dictaphone speaking, not the man. And the murderer switched it on. Then he must have been in the room at that minute? Possibly. But we must not exclude the likelihood of some mechanical device having been applied. Something after the nature of a time lock, or even of a simple alarm clock. But in that case, we must add two qualifications to our imaginary portrait of the murderer. It must be someone who knew of Mr. Ackroyd's purchase of the dictaphone, and also someone with the necessary mechanical knowledge. I had got thus far in my own mind when he came to the footprints on the window ledge. Here there were three conclusions open to me. 1. They might really have been made by Ralph Patten. He had been at Fernley that night, and might have climbed into the study and found his uncle dead there. That was one hypothesis. 2. There was the possibility that the footmarks might have been made by somebody else who happened to have the same kind of studs in his shoe. But the inmates of the house had shoes soled with crepe rubber, and I declined to believe in the coincidence of someone from outside having the same kind of shoes as Ralph Patton wore. Charles Kent, as we know from the barmaid at the Dog and Whistle, had a pair of boots clean dropping off him. Those prints were made by someone deliberately trying to throw suspicion on Ralph Patton. To test this last conclusion, it was necessary to ascertain certain facts. One pair of Ralph's shoes had been obtained from the Three Boars by the police. Neither Ralph nor anyone else could have worn them that evening, since they were downstairs being cleaned. According to the police theory, Ralph was wearing another pair of the same kind, and I found out that it was true that he had two pairs. Now, for my theory to be proved correct, it was necessary for the murderer to have worn Ralph's shoes that evening, in which case Ralph must have been wearing yet a third pair of footwear of the same kind. I could hardly suppose that he would bring 3 pairs of shoes all alike. The third pair of footwear were more likely to be boots. I got your sister to make inquiries on this point, laying some stress on the color, in order, I admit frankly, to obscure the real reason for my asking. You know the result of her investigations? You know the result of her investigations. Ralph Patton had a pair of boots with him. The first question I asked him when he came to my house yesterday morning was that he was wearing on his feet on the fatal night. He replied at once that he had worn boots. He was still wearing them, in fact, having nothing else to put on. So we get a step further in our description of the murderer, a person who had the opportunity to take those shoes of Ralph Patton's from the Three Boars that day. He paused and then said with a slightly raised voice, "There is one further point. The murderer must have been a person who had the opportunity to purloin that dagger from the silver table. You might argue that anyone in the house might have done so, but I will recall to you that Miss Ackroyd was very positive that the dagger was not there when she examined the silver table." He paused again. "Let us recapitulate, now that all is clear. A person who was at the Three Boars earlier that day, a person who knew Ackroyd well enough to know that he had purchased a dictaphone, a person who was of a mechanical turn of mind, who had the opportunity to take the dagger from the silver table before Miss Flora arrived, who had with him a receptacle suitable for hiding the dictaphone, such as a black bag, and who had the study to himself for a few minutes after the crime was discovered, while Parker was telephoning for the police. In fact, Dr. Shepard." There was a dead silence for a minute and a half. Then I laughed. "You're mad." I said. "No," said Poirot placidly. "I am not mad. It was the little discrepancy in time that first drew my attention to you, right at the beginning." "Discrepancy in time?" I queried, puzzled. This is chapter 26. "But yes, you will remember that everyone agreed, you yourself included, that it took 5 minutes to walk from the lodge to the house. Less if you took the shortcut to the terrace. But if you left the house at 10 minutes to 9, both by your own statement and that of Parker, and yet it was 9 o'clock when you passed through the lodge gates. It was a chilly night. Not an evening a man would be inclined to dawdle. Why had you taken 10 minutes to do a 5 minutes walk? All along I realized that we had only your statement for that if the study window had ever been fastened. Ackroyd asked you if you had done so. He never looked to see. Supposing, then, that the study window was unfastened, would there be time in that 10 minutes for you to run around the outside of the house, change your shoes, climb in through the window, kill Ackroyd, and get to the gate by 9 o'clock? I decided against that theory, since in all probability a man as nervous as Ackroyd that night would hear you climbing in. As nervous as Ackroyd was that night would hear you coming in. and then there would have been a struggle. But supposing that you killed Ackroyd before you left, as you were standing beside the chair, then you go out of the front door, run around to the summer house, take Ralph Patton's shoes out of the bag you brought up with you that night, slip them on, walk through the mud in them, and leave prints on the window ledge. You climb in, lock the study door on the inside, run back to the summer house, change back into your own shoes, and race down to the gate. I went through similar actions the other day when you were with Mrs. Ackroyd. It took 10 minutes exactly. Then home, and an alibi, since you had timed the dictaphone for 9:30. My dear Poirot, I said in a voice that sounded strange and forced to my own ears, you've been brooding over this case too long. What on earth had I to gain by murdering Ackroyd? Safety. It was you who blackmailed Mrs. Ferrars. Who could have had a better knowledge of what killed Mr. Ferrars than the doctor who was attending him? When you spoke to me that first day in the garden, you mentioned a legacy received about a year ago. I have been unable to discover any trace of a legacy. You had to invent some way of accounting for Mrs. Ferrars' £20,000. It has not done you much good. You lost most of it in speculation. Then you put the screw on too hard, and Mrs. Ferrars took a way out that you had not expected. If Ackroyd had learned the truth, he would have had no mercy on you. You were ruined forever. And the telephone call, I asked, trying to rally. You have a plausible explanation of that also, I suppose? I will confess to you that is my greatest stumbling block when I found that a call had actually been put through to you from King Abbott's station. I at first believed that you had simply invented the story. It was a very clever touch that you must have some excuse for arriving at Farnley, finding the body, and so getting the chance to remove the dictaphone on which your alibi depended. I had a very vague notion of how it was worked. To see your sister that first day and inquired as to what patients you had seen on Friday morning. I had no thought of Miss Russell in my mind at the time. Her visit was a lucky coincidence, since it distracted your mind from the real object of my questions. I found what I was looking for. Among your patients that morning was the steward of an American liner, who more suitable than he to be leaving for Liverpool by the train that evening. And afterwards he would be on the high seas, well out of the way. I noted that the Orion sailed on Saturday, and having obtained the name of the steward, I'd sent him a wireless message asking a certain question. This is his reply you saw me receive just now. He held out the message to me. It ran as follows. Quite correct, Dr. Shepard asked me to leave a note at a patient's house. I was to ring him up from the station with the reply. Reply was no answer. Whoa. It was a clever idea, said Poirot. The call was genuine. Your sister saw you take it, but there was only one man's word as to what was actually said. Your sister saw you take it, but there was only one man's word as to what was actually said. Your own. I yawned. All this, I said, is very interesting, but hardly in the sphere of practical politics. You think not? Remember what I said. The truth goes to Inspector Raglan in the morning. But for the sake of your good sister, I am willing to give you the chance of another way out. There might be, for instance, an overdose of a sleeping draught. You comprehend me? But Captain Ralph Patton must be cleared. Ça va sans dire. I should suggest that you finish that very interesting manuscript of yours, but abandoning your former reticence. You seem to be very prolific of suggestions, I remarked. Are you sure you're quite finished? Now that you reminded me of the fact, it is true there is one more thing. It would be most unwise on your part to silence me as you silenced Monsieur Ackroyd. The kind of business does not... Whoops. Damn monitor. Oh, what a bummer. Here it comes. Okay, here we go. Now that you reminds me as a fact, it is true that there is one more thing. It would be most unwise on your part to attempt to silence me as you silence Monsieur Ackroyd. That kind of business does not succeed against Hercule Poirot, you understand. My dear Poirot, I said, smiling a little, whatever else I may be, I am not a fool. I rose to my feet. Well, well, I said with a slight yawn, I must be off home. Thank you for a most interesting and instructive evening. Poirot also rose and bowed with his accustomed politeness as I passed out of the room. So Shepard did it? 5 a.m. Oh, chapter 27, Apologia, whatever that means. 5 a.m. I am very tired, but I have finished my task. My arms ache from writing. A strange end to my manuscript. I meant it to be published someday as the history of one of Poirot's failures. Odd how things pan out. All along I've had a premonition of disaster. From the moment I saw Ralph Patten and Mrs. Ferrars with their heads together, I thought then that she was confiding in him. As it happened, I was quite wrong there, but the idea persisted even after I went into the study with Ackroyd that night until he told me the truth. Poor old Ackroyd. I'm always glad that I gave him a chance. I urged him to read that letter before it was too late. Or let me be honest. Didn't I subconsciously realize that with a pig-headed chap like him, it was my best chance of getting him not to read it? His nervousness that night was interesting psychologically. He knew danger was close at hand, and yet he never suspected me. The dagger was an afterthought. I'd brought up a very handy little weapon of my own. But when I saw the dagger lying on the silver table, it occurred to me at once how much better it would be to use a weapon that couldn't be traced to me. I suppose I must have meant to murder him all along. As soon as I heard of Mrs. Ferrars' death, I felt convinced that she should have told him everything before she died. When I met him and he seemed so agitated, I thought that perhaps he knew the truth. But he couldn't bring himself to believe it and was going to give me the chance of refuting it. So I went home and took my precautions. If the trouble were, after all, only something to do with Ralph, well, no harm would have been done. The dictaphone he had given me 2 days ago to adjust. Something had gone a little wrong with it, and I persuaded him to let me have a go at it instead of sending it back. I did what I wanted to and took it up with me in my bag that evening. I am rather pleased with myself as a writer. What could be neater, for instance, than the following? The letters were brought in at 20 minutes to 9. It was just on 10 minutes to 9 when I left him, the letter still unread. I hesitated with my hand on the door handle, looking back and wondering if there was anything I had left undone. All true, you see. But suppose I had put a row of stars after the first sentence. Would somebody then have wondered what exactly happened in that blank 10 minutes? When I looked around the room from the door, I was quite satisfied. Nothing had been left undone. The dictaphone was on the table by the window, timed to go off at 9:30. The mechanism of that little device was rather clever, based upon the principle of an alarm clock, and the armchair was pulled out so as to hide it from the door. I must admit that it gave me rather a shock to run into Parker just outside the door. I have faithfully recorded that fact. Then later, when the body was discovered, and I sent Parker to telephone for the police, what a judicious use of words. I did what little had to be done. It was quite little. Just to shove the dictaphone into my bag and push back the chair against the wall in its proper place. I never dreamed that Parker would have noticed that chair. Logically, he ought to have been so agog over the body as to blind himself to everything else. But I hadn't reckoned with the trained servant complex. I wish I could have known beforehand that Flora was going to say she'd seen her uncle alive at 9:45. That puzzled me more than I can say. In fact, all through the case there have been little things that puzzled me hopelessly. Everyone seems to have taken a hand. My greatest fear all through has been Caroline. I have fancied she might guess. Curious the way she spoke that day of my strain of weakness. Well, she will never know the truth. There is, as Poirot said, one way out. I can trust him. He and Inspector Raglan will manage it between them. I should not like Caroline to know. She is fond of me, and then, too, she is proud. My death will be a grief to her, but grief passes. When I have finished writing, I shall enclose the whole manuscript in an envelope and address it to Poirot. And then, what shall it be? Veronal? There would be a kind of poetic justice. Not that I take any responsibility for Mrs. Farrar's death. It was the direct consequence of her own actions. I feel no pity for her. I have no pity for myself either. So let it be Veronal. But I wish Hercule had never retired from work and come here to grow vegetable marrows. The end. Wow. It was Shepard. Oh, I can't believe that. I didn't see that coming at all. Oh, man. Sorry about the interruptions with my monitors. I promise to get that fixed before we do another book. But wow. That's crazy, man. This whole time I was suspecting it was Raymond. Oh, that's a trip. Wow. I want to thank you guys for being patient through my little interruptions. Luckily, the monitors didn't stay off much and the computer kept running. But yeah, wow. So that's a great book. I certainly didn't see that little twist coming at the end there. I'm sure that's what they all say, but man, so cool. Agatha Christie, man. This is my journey into Agatha Christie stuff for the. Hey, there's Michael. Yeah, oh, my pleasure, Michael. Thanks for sticking it out, man. We're gonna pick up another book soon, but I think my favorite part of reading this book, it's very easy to speak it out loud the way she wrote. I'm actually pretty impressed that the language is fairly modern, considering the fact that this was 1926, I believe. But I did not see that coming with the Doctor. That's super cool. I think that's one of the best books I've ever read, but that's not saying much because I haven't read very many. So this is helping me read. But anyway, I'm going to let everybody go to bed now. I want to say how much I appreciate y'all stopping by. I will post this in my reels, and when you do see it, maybe tomorrow, there will be a link there where you can donate to Everyday Action. If you've got like a couple bucks, you can throw to Everyday Action. I think that would be great. You know, if you want to balance it out later, you can steal an extra bagel from Crafty. Hey, Caroline, my pleasure. I do enjoy doing this, and I'm looking forward to doing more. I would like, for those that are still watching, let me know what you'd like to hear me read. And bear in mind, if you prefer, you know, you can tell me a book that you haven't read. But I think I'm going to do another Agatha Christie novel, just so that I can predictably, you know, I know how to read the way she wrote a little better than I did a week ago. So we're going to do this again with a new book, and I'll announce it on Instagram as soon as I get that book picked out. But anyway, it's time for everybody to go to bed. So everybody have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for stopping by, and we will see you soon. Might possibly be tomorrow, but definitely no later than Friday. Okay? Have a great night.